Now, the government has announced that the legal but harmful clause in the online safety bill, it was a very controversial clause, has now been dropped. The controversial clause would have allowed more remit for police and speech online, as if there isn't enough of that already, and its removal has been praised by free speech campaigners, like myself. But proponents of the clause say it's necessary to protect children on the internet. But in this digital age, who is ultimately responsible for child safety? And can we do it whilst also upholding freedom of speech online? Well, joining me to discuss this is the Executive Director of the Open Rights Group, Jim Killock, and Matthew Lesh, Head of Public Policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Jim, where do we strike the balance here? What's the halfway house? Because there are cases like the Archie Battersby case, for example, where, you know, you've got the influence of TikTok, for example, playing a role in child safety and all of these other issues. Where do we strike the balance between freedom of speech online and the protection of some of society's most vulnerable groups?
Well, you know, it is genuinely hard, but I think we have to remember that the burden of protecting children has to be on adults, it has to be on their parents, it has to be on teachers. In the same way as we can't stop the possibility of danger when a child goes on the street, down to a park. You know, you can't remove danger entirely, and to try to pretend that we can is to place a burden on society which is entirely unreasonable. You know, we can't cotton wool the entire of our playgrounds in case there are accidents. That's not a reasonable proposition. No one's proposing it, but we are apparently proposing that for the internet. The key thing we have to do, I think, is to remember that the way that children evolve is that they get more access to content, they get more access to websites, they get more freedom as they grow up. And it is parents and teachers who understand the development of a child so that they know the kind of responsibilities they can take. Expecting technology to do this when the technology cannot understand the mind or the responsibility or the maturity of a child is asking for an awful lot of problems. And it is likely also to stunt the development of children, I'm afraid to say.
OK, so Matthew, then, on that point, you've got the likes of Nadine Dorries, who was the former cabinet minister that was actually putting through the online safety bill. She's saying the government absolutely must keep it in place, keep it intact. Why is she wrong and you right?
Look, what the government's talking about doing, it seems, is removing the legal but harmful provisions in the online safety bill as they result and relate to adults. Now, the technical phrase in legislation is content that is harmful to adults. I don't think that the government's looking at removing the provisions in relation to children whatsoever. Now, as Jim said, I think that they provide a bit of false hope. But the idea that removing sections of the bill that purely relate to adults, that purely try to censor what individuals who are of adult age in any way related to protecting children is going to fix or cause problems for children is obviously ridiculous. But what I think the problem here is it's not like free speech is suddenly being solved because we've got rid of legal but harmful for adults. I think at a much more deeper level, the legislation needs to be reconsidered. The legislation requires general monitoring for a whole range of priority content areas. That means the online digital companies having to look at what you're saying and make judgments about whether or not they think things are illegal in an instantaneous way using automated systems. Now, they have to do that not at the normal kind of legal threshold, but they have to remove anything they reasonably believe could be illegal. So the government is effectively lowering the thresholds for removing of illegal content, making the firms automatically go through all our speech online, and they're not expecting that to have a negative impact on free speech. I think it's extremely dangerous for free speech in its current state, even without legal but harmful provisions.
Yeah, because
let's remember also, it means that people have to be verified and checked whether they're adults or not for this to work. Because this content still has to be checked. The question is, when you go onto Twitter, when you go on a Reddit, are you an adult or a child? Does that site know that you're an adult or a child? And of course it doesn't, right? It has literally no idea. So it has to censor everything as if you are a child until you prove you're an adult, which means what? Uploading passports, having your face checked by some kind of identity software, sharing your bank card details. We end up in the whole situation we were debating about for pornography a few years ago, but now it's not just pornography sites, it's literally all the sites that you visit every day at the moment. And then you ask yourself, are these companies all going to do that? I mean, some of them will not. Some of them will just say,
I dare say Elon Musk would shriek at doing such a thing. And I tell you what, a lot of my viewers who are emailing in now will shriek in horror at the idea that big tech keeps a bank of all of our identification and, has everything on us that they can possibly obtain. I mean, Matthew Lesh, you are someone who I assume is naturally opposed to that sort of measure. But is that the route that we've got to go down in order to protect children online?
Well, I think we've got to be careful about not giving us a sense of false security. As I think Jim has quite persuasively tried to explain, no matter what you do, children are going to face, in fact, we're all going to face dangers in our lives. And the idea that we can magic that away with a piece of legislation is purely mythic. I think the other issue as well with the bill in this respect, though, is not just the fact that you're going to be scanning everyone's face potentially to work out their age, but also in order for the content requirements to work, you're going to be scanning everyone's private messaging as well, including potentially encrypted communications. And what we're getting from this discussion is this is a 270-page piece of legislation. It's extremely complex. Its goals are broad. It gives quite extraordinary discretionary powers to Ofcom to interpret all these different parts and decide what they're going to mean. It is a recipe for censorship and state control and state direction of the internet and what we're allowed to believe and what we're allowed to say and what we're allowed to think. And I think it's quite scary that the Conservative government's going ahead with this.
So, Matthew, would you like to see even more parts of the bill removed?
I mean, absolutely. I think the government shouldn't be going ahead with general monitoring. I think they need to be very careful about putting in requirements to age verify users or age assure users. I think they need to definitely take out encrypted communications from the scope and private communications from the scope of this legislation. What I message between you and I, Darren, shouldn't be a matter for Ofcom guidance or big tech oversight. I think there's a whole bunch of very important changes government needs to make. And that's before we even think about the regulatory burdens here. What is this going to cost British businesses? Why are we having a more regulated sector than the EU? I thought we left the EU to have less regulation, less red tape, not to be harsher on some of the world's most innovative companies, as well as quite harsh to our own startups and smaller companies in the UK who might struggle to comply.
Yeah, Jim, as well as coming back to that, I'm wondering what's happened to the role of the parent, right? Why are parents allowing children, off the leash on the internet, running wild, knowing that there's this vast amount of content on the internet for children to potentially come across? Do you think that actually we need to have that conversation about saying, well, actually the impetus should be on the parent rather than big tech?
Look, I mean, it's not that big tech should do nothing. Of course it isn't. And of course there are things that can sensibly be done. But I think, you look at, say, the Netherlands, it's always those kind of countries, right, where they have the conversations with their kids. They talk to them, they start to explain the risks, and the kids become more resilient and they understand how to avoid the problems on the internet. Here, we just pretend the whole thing's not a problem, sweep it under the carpet, say, well, no, someone else will deal with it. And of course, the children don't get properly educated, and that puts them more at risk. I think, yes, we do have to have that sensible conversation. We also have to remember that kids are very tech savvy. So if we expect that the solutions are going to be delivered by technology, well, that, again, it's just ignoring what will actually happen. What will happen if these sites do end up with age barriers for just the UK is children will, particularly teenagers, will work out how to use VPNs, which they all do anyway. They will go and log in pretending that they're in Germany or in Switzerland or something. And, the whole problem just persists. But we can all pretend it's been solved and be happy about it. Meanwhile, who really suffers? Well, of course, it's the children who are not being educated about those risks and who are putting themselves in danger without those conversations being had. So, yes, we absolutely have to have that conversation. We also have to be realistic about what technology does, and what it doesn't do is solve social problems. It helps us communicate, but it doesn't order society or change people's motivations or the things that they desire to look at or the things they want to explore. It cannot do that.
Yeah, and I worry actually that there are severe unintended consequences to this bill. But as Matthew Lesh will well know, Who hasn't met a politician that accidentally ends up falling foul of unintended consequences? But folks, we're going to have to leave it there. Jim Killock, Executive Director of the Open Rights Group, and Matthew Lesh, Head of Public Policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs. I thank you both for your time.